yourself, or what made you have to rethink this whole strategy?
Well, Mike, I appreciate the question. If I may, I'd like to even take a step back from prior to Adidas, because I think this shift happened. A significant shift happened when I was there, but really, when I first really kind of started to hear the term war for talent, it was back in the 90s during the dot-com boom. Silicon Valley was on fire. You had a lot of darling startups that were, a block away from each other and really competing probably more intensely than any corporations have ever competed before to get the best talent in the door, and they were really going after similar talent. And because it was so heated down there, you saw if you just take sort of San Francisco alone, you watched labor costs. Actually, if you look at sort of labor cost charts, probably for the 50 years before, it was a gradual climb. When you hit the dot-com boom, they shot straight up. It was part of the war. The John Sullivans of the world, that some of you may or may not know, he's sort of a guru in the industry. He teaches in the Bay Area now. He would talk to CEOs of tech companies, and they're about to do a layoff in a startup opening up across the street, and he would have the CEO time the layoff for literally weeks before the company was going to start up, because he knew the startup would hire most of the people, and they would have a strategy around it literally to squash the competition. And it was pretty broad. Companies weren't necessarily targeting specific talent. I think the need and the competition was so strong, they built large talent acquisition teams fast. They invested very heavily. When recruiting professionals went into the CEOs of their organizations, it was often the point of argument they would use to get funded. They say, our turnover is high, our top competition's taking our best people, and they would work off the fair points of the VPs and business leaders to get funded for their programs. And this went on for a while, and I think this is even where employer branding really started to take off, because if you look at what happened during that time, and prior to Adidas, I worked for 7.5 years at a technology PR firm, Wagner Edstrom Worldwide, where I led the talent acquisition function for our Microsoft PR team. And that's really where I cut my teeth and learned a lot about branding. But so we did PR for Microsoft, and one of the things we saw, Google came out with, their leadership team came out with, the famous sort of, I guess their mantra, which was, 20% of your time could be used to invent and create and do what you want. It's sort of like you now have freedom. And this was now you went from war for talent, and now you've applied some branding principles, because this was extremely powerful in the marketplace when Microsoft had reached a growth point where you had a lot of silos in the business. You had Windows, rushing to launch product at a different timeline than Office. A lot of internal competition. People felt like the bureaucracy was becoming overwhelming, and so you had these great, brilliant technologists that felt trapped. Google applies, this employer branding tactic, and all of a sudden, it's like, this light bulb turns on and people say, hey, wait a minute, I can leave here and I can have the cuffs freed. 20% of my time, I get to invent again. And they started getting Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Steve. So is this the EVP? Are you saying Google perfected an EVP? And if you take us through that, is that the right thing to move towards, that Google had an employee value proposition?
Absolutely. And I'm I'm not convinced that it was even HR that came up with this. I think I think employee value propositions, and Mike, you're in PR and you know this, and I think, companies have a master narrative typically, and it's sort of that elevator pitch of, if you have 30 seconds to tell a CEO what your company is about in an elevator, what are you going to say? And Google can probably talk about a lot of things, but that's a pretty powerful message right there to start with. 20% of your time, you get freedom, you get to invent. And, whether that was a strategy out of HR or whether that was their leadership team or whether they meant to do that, it became the master narrative of that organization or their employee value proposition. Sometimes the market decides what that's going to be for an organization. As an example, British Petroleum, they probably have a master narrative, that is determined by the public. And they could say whatever they want about the organization, but there's something going to be applied to them, and that is going to sort of translate into their EVP as well. So yes, employer value proposition, I think, is important and it's critical. I think we are moving to that, and I think organizations should do everything in their power to figure out what that is and create a culture behind it so it's authentic.
So what's the can you tell us, just give an example, what's the Adidas EVP?
Another good question. We put a lot of work into this, and I can tell you we basically went outside the industry and we said, look, we don't want to look at what other HR people are doing. We don't want to look at what recruitment advertising firms are going to tell us. We started reading a lot in looking at what top consumer brands were doing. And Steve Bonomo, who is our global head of recruitment, asked me to fly out to Germany to host a workshop with some of our top marketing people, some of our top communications, and our HR people. And we did an exercise called difference in kind versus difference in degree. And it was to get at exactly what you're asking about our employer value proposition. And what we wanted to determine before just coming up with a statement was, how are we different in kind? Meaning, how are we differentiated and truly unique, and how are we different in degree? So how are we better or worse than the competition? And we put two large columns up on this huge board, and we had our marketing guys throwing out words, and our communications and our HR people. And at the end of the exercise, we had things like international, 160 countries, like great supply chain, blah, 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 great product. And we're looking at it and we're going, wow, there's not much in the difference in kind column. So one of our marketing experts said, hey, why don't you bring in this guy named Mike Yap. He's works at a branding agency. He's worked with our company 10 years. Just talk to him. Maybe he can help. So we brought in Mike Yap, and he brought all these video reels with him, and he almost looked like a little bit younger version of Nick Nolte, maybe before he turned into an alcoholic. Really cool surfer dude from California. But anyways, Mike gets up, and he's this really dynamic guy, and he's like, guys, I can't believe you can't see this. He's like, it's easy for me. He's like, I've worked for this company for 10 years. I've traveled all over the world. I've walked in the office of, an intern after, 2 weeks that can run marathons, and I've walked into the office of 60-year-olds that can jog 5 feet. And he's like, the thing that they're all connected to is passion for sport. It's the true connection to the athlete and the ability to shape the future of sport. And he goes, and let me show you why it's different than your competition. And he puts in some reels of behind the scenes footage of ad shoots we're doing. And if you guys have ever seen the movie Jerry Maguire, when Cubic Downing Jr. In the end basically hugs Tom Cruise, and the other guy's like, I want an agent like that. Basically, it was the athletes interacting with our employees, and I mean, they're hugging, they're laughing, they're sharing stories, and he goes, this is how you're different. He goes, you guys care about your athletes, you interact with them. He's like, the guys across the river, they turn their athletes into demigods. You know, they have them flying across the court, single players, and they portray this sort of untouchable feeling. And he goes, that works for him. It works for him in the American marketplace. That's fine. But he goes, from an employee standpoint, if you go onto their campus and you get the email saying, you know, Tiger Woods is walking through and do not approach him and don't do this and don't do that, and you walk onto, you know, the Adidas Village in Portland, Oregon, and, you know, Kevin Garnett's walking through and your president buys jerseys for everybody and asks them to clap when he walks in and approach him and shake his hand and introduce yourself, you see a very, very different organization. And he's like, that is the essence of why people join this organization. And you know, we thought about it and we're like, duh, of course. Look, you know, when we started this, we even talked to a lot of different teams. And one of the key principles to branding, and where most organizations fail with their EVPs and coming up with kind of their positioning, is they have no ability to focus. It's one of the hardest things. You're going to get input from everybody. Everybody has some idea, and everybody's going to push their agenda. And brands fail if you can't focus. Apple's an amazing example. They just beat Microsoft in market cap. Whoever thought they can do that, but it's because they're insane about keeping their brand 100% intact and unified. So, you know, for us, we heard messages from our supply chain team saying, look, we don't want to push, you know, this connection to sport and the athlete and blah, blah, blah. We want to push a supply chain message. Well, you know, if you're Adidas and you're pushing a supply chain message in let's say, Nuremberg, Germany, you got SAP across this, you know, street pushing a supply chain message, and they happen to be literally known for, let's say, supply chain stuff, or Walmart's pushing supply chain in terms of a retail environment. They're known for this. You know, but what we can do is we can go into SAP and we can find their very best supply chain person that also happens to be a die-hard soccer fan and say, hey, you can come do supply chain for us, and now you can be connected to the World Cup in a way you've never been connected before. You want to go to South Africa? You're there. So, you know, that is the message that we want to push first. If we're up 30 seconds in the elevator and the CEO says, hey, what's the essence of working for this company? My first reaction to them is, you get to shape the future of sport. You get to be connected to your favorite athletes. Now, if I find out this guy works in supply chain, then I'm going to tell him more about the supply chain function. Probably not until he's interested, or probably not until I can tell he's interested or passionate about sport. But at that point, I have him. And so with brands, if you don't push that key message out that's authentic to who you are and get that excitement level up right away, before you start pushing the 500 other boring messages that most companies push, to me, you've lost the best talent. And you can go on probably. So, oh, go ahead. Sorry, I get a little carried away.
Right. No, it's great. So what you're saying, and this is what HR practitioners around the world have to understand, is